Tatou. All right, and we are going to be rolling the live stream in 3, 2, 1. I'm just going to hand over to Barney Thomas.
Kia ora tātou. E tuaki ani I runga te whakaaro kotahi. Tū hono whaka kotahitanga e te kaupapa hire ki tēnei pō, e te whiti kōrero. Nō reira, ngā mihi te Tauihu. Happy New Year to you all. Nō reira, mi noi tātou. E tō mātou matanu I te rangi e te atua kaharawa, whakarongo mai ki a mātou, ho mai tō wairua e te manaakitanga, e raro e te korowai te rangi Māori e, ake, amene.
Ko ngā heke ngā mai o ngā tupuna I ngā tau o tētahi mano warura wei.
Te heke I raro, te heke te taramoa, te heke hauhaua, te heke mio puta, kua patua no te ata, kutni ho puta, mo te riune, e aha, te heke nui, te ki tuki aruhe, te heke mio mano, te mana o te whenua, ke te mate ua. Ko nā uri o nā heke ngā tiwa tunei, e ia. Kia ora, good evening everybody. You probably think I'm an Nelsonian, but I was originally born in Picton. So nō reira, tēnā koutou.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou I tēnei pō nō reira e te whānau. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Waiau, ko Miriana Stevens, tōku ingoa, ko Ngāti Rārua, Ngāti Rangi nui o ku iwi, I whānau au ki Motueka, nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa. My name is Miriana Stevens, and I always say this, but I do come from the metropolis of Motueka. It is the centre of my universe in terms of where I was born and raised and where I currently live. I'm a director of Wakatu Incorporation, and it's a very proud organisation. We're a family business, and we're a large family because there's 4,000 of us. They don't all live in the metropolis of Motueka, but we're also very respectful that we are custodians of a large estate that starts from Mōhua Golden Bay. We come into the Able Tasman, through into Motueka, Richmond, Nelson, and then we push across here to the Wairau. We're farmers of the land and sea, and when we started about 10 years ago really to start to think about our service to this region, our footprint, we then designed Te Pai Tawhiti, which is our 500-year intergenerational vision. We absolutely love this place, we absolutely love the people, and we're very excited to be able to present the Te Tauihu intergenerational strategy in terms of the journey that we are now embarking on. The waiata that we sung tonight really reflects a series of epic migrations that when our tupuna, when our ancestors, they left the North Island, they settled here into Tauihu. So when I think that I'm having a hard day, I certainly think about those migrations and about our families who came from the north to settle here into Tauihu. And perhaps my hard day isn't so hard after all. So the Te Tauihu intergenerational strategy is really about a new way of thinking and about approaching regional development. It's about enabling long-term planning, connecting our decision-making to those things that are really important to us here as the communities in Te Tauihu, and it's about unlocking the potential for our communities for the benefit of our people, our environment, and our collective economy as we move into the future. Who's involved? And some may say, why is Wakatu Incorporation leading this strategy? And as a legal entity, we celebrated 40 years in 2017. We started to think about what might the next 40 years look like, and then we started to think actually anything is possible because of our love for this place. So how might we collectively think about an intergenerational vision, think about actually what does the well-being and the wellness look like for the communities that we serve. We know that we have some major issues in terms of the environment, actually in terms of our families, food security, etc., and how might we as communities start to design that as we move forward. We're really heartened, actually. When we started this journey, we spoke to our whānau hapu iwi, we spoke to the business community, our local councils, NMIT, the big businesses, and we said, are we up for this challenge? We might not know what it looks like. We might not have all the solutions, but if we are going to create a movement, let's try and do this together. So we're really heartened about that. And of course, at that time as well, the Provincial Growth Fund also had a funding opportunity there. We applied to it and we were successful in terms of being able to start this journey. So when we think about it, when you start to create a movement, you need the people. And how might we meaningfully engage to actually hear the voices of the people? We're really excited in the fact that we're going to start talking to our rangatahi, because they will be our youth, they will be our future leaders. So how might we engage with them to actually start to think about what does the vision for the region look like? And then how about then we start to think about collectively what that looks like. So these forums, we've just come out of 3 days working with leaders and with people that are passionate about making change. We had our first Te Tauihu talk in Nelson the other night. It was around resilience. And we've been really, I think, heartened in the fact that people are engaging and they want to make a difference. So I'm not saying that we have all the answers, but we're certainly having a fun time. We're certainly wanting to connect better with all of you. So thank you all for coming out tonight. And we hope that you enjoy our second Te Tauihu talk tonight on sustainability. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
E ako nui, e ako rahi, tēnā koutou katoa. E tū ana au, I raro e te maru o tōku maru, tū mai. Ngā awa, e rere, e rere, e rere. Ka mihi ake ki a koutou, I runga te āhuatanga o tēnei wā. Nō te tai tokerau tēnei, engari e tupu ake au I motueka. Nō reira, me mihi ki te hunga kāinga, ngā iwi taketake o te Tauihu, tēnā koutou. Kei ngā pai kōrero, mō tēnei rangi, kei te mihi atu. Nā koutou mātou whakahōnore, koutou anō hoki, ngā koro mātua, ngā rangatira, me ngā kākā wahanui o te hāpori, tēnā koutou. Kāti, kua whakarauika tātou I runga te karanga o te Tauihu. Te karanga whenua, te karanga mōna, te karanga tāngata. Nō reira, ka whakapau kaha ana au I te kaupapa o te Tauihu. Kōrero kei runga, raru kei raro, mā tātou katoa te huarahi tika e whai ana. Mā whero, mā pango, ka oti ai te mahi. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, and thank you so much for coming along to attend our first Te Tauihu talks in Waido, Marlborough. It's been an absolute pleasure for us to travel today and join everyone here for the strategic workshops we've been holding. There's been some extremely stimulating and productive conversations today, and we thank everyone for your participation in the project so far, and we're excited for all of those who this is your first introduction to the project. We're excited to start this conversation with you tonight. My name is Johnny O'Donnell, for those of you who I haven't yet had the pleasure of meeting, and I've got the honour of facilitating tonight's conversation. A few housekeeping things. The first and most obvious one you would have picked up at the start is that we are live streaming tonight's event. So what we wanted to do as part of this Te Tauihu Talk series is take the conversation across all of the parts that make up the region of Te Tauihu. And as part of doing that, we wanted to make sure that if we were having a conversation on sustainability in Blenheim, that anyone across the region could participate, and so we're live streaming everything. It's very dark in here, so you're unlikely to be caught out on camera, but just be aware that we are filming everything tonight, and so out in the foyer and everything we'll be grabbing some shots, and we hope you're okay with that, and if not, you should probably leave now, because that's what we're doing. We've got a very big team behind tonight, so thank you to everyone who's helped pull it together, from the AV team to our Te Tauihu intergenerational strategy team, and in particular tonight to Glyn, Neil, Alistair, Hans, and everyone else who has supported us here in Marlborough to get the word out and ensure that you all had the opportunity to participate tonight. In terms of housekeeping for this venue in particular, obviously no beverages outside of the venue itself. If the fire alarm sounds, then we make our way out to the main entrance and gather in the car park, and in the case of an earthquake, the usual standard of stop, drop and roll. And there are toilets, of course, which you can, although it's all closed off tonight, you are welcome to leave to go to the toilet. We're not going to hold you here for the whole 2 hours. We will break halfway through, by the way, so we've got 2 different formats running tonight. And a very, very important message to kick things off is that as part of that live stream, that is also your channel to ask questions and participate in tonight's conversation. So now would be a very good time for those of you who are on Facebook to jump on the Te Tauihu Intergenerational Strategy page on Facebook and share the live stream, because we want as many people as possible to participate in this conversation. As Miriana mentioned, we started in Nelson on Monday night, and by the time we all got to bed about midnight, there had been 2,000 people participating in that live stream. So incredibly powerful to be able to use social media throughout this process to really replicate what we're doing on the ground online for those people with a connection to Tauihu who could not be here tonight. So if you're not on Facebook, then the next best option is to head to our website, which is tetauihu.nz. And if you just put a /live in, then you'll arrive straight on the page and be able to ask any questions. The reason this is important is because we've got a reasonably structured conversation to be had with our 3 panellists for the first part of this evening, but then we'll break, recharge the glasses, go to the toilet, have a breather, and then we'll come back. And the second half is all about your questions. So throughout the process, if something comes up for you, if something resonates, then it's your opportunity to leave a question, and we'll make sure we get to it into the second half of this evening and ask the panellists that. So I really do encourage you to participate, and also including the questions that we'll be getting from the live stream tonight. But without further ado, I want to introduce our stellar lineup of panellists. I'm very, very excited about the conversation and the calibre of panellists this evening. No pressure to the 3 of you. First up, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bruce Campbell. Dr. Bruce Campbell is a very well recognised and sought-after expert who is passionate about building partnerships with Māori and accelerating innovation, education and talent development in Aotearoa. He holds board positions as Director of Horticulture New Zealand, Director of the New Zealand Wine Growers Research Centre, and is Chair of the Northland Horticultural Careers Progression Governance Group. Bruce is experienced in strategies for innovation and was previously Chief Operating Officer at Plant and Food Research. He has a PhD in ecology from the University of Sheffield and was a recipient of the 2017 Prime Minister's Science Award, the 2017 Horticulture New Zealand Industry Service Award, and the 2016 Royal Society for New Zealand Thomson Medal for Outstanding Leadership of Agriculture and Horticultural Science. And after spending a couple of days with Bruce in the workshops, can I say, Bruce, what a pleasure and an honour it is to have your contribution throughout this project and to have you here with us tonight. So please welcome Dr. Bruce Campbell. You want to join us on stage? In the region here in Te Tauihu, Jan Hania, so it's my pleasure to welcome you here, Jan. Jan is of Ngāti Tū Wharetoa and Ngāti Raukawa ki te Tonga descent. He is very passionate about large-scale environmental restoration, collaborative processes and systems change to achieve impact at scale, integrating Western science, mātauranga, business and philanthropic approaches. He previously worked with consulting and directly with government, regional councils, farmers and commercial entities to improve land use, water and waste systems both in New Zealand and overseas. But Jan actually began his career here as an aircraft engineer in Woodburn. So he spent 5 years with the Department of Conservation, and he now works for the Next Foundation as their environmental director. Alongside that, his other current appointments include Project Director for Taranaki Maunga Project, Project Advisor and Governance Member for Predator Free Wellington, Te Mana Huana Aruki Board Member, Biological Heritage National Science Challenge Board Member. So absolute pleasure to have you here. Please welcome Jan Hania. And getting even more local now, it's a pleasure to welcome Fiona van Petegem. Fiona is passionate about positive change and has built her career working in manufacturing and product development in New Zealand, China, the Netherlands and Germany, both as a designer and industrialisation engineer in areas including lean management, effective process improvement, global product compliance, effective product development, and as well as risk assessment procedures. She is a member of the Global Association for Transition Engineering and the Sustainable Business Network, having returned to New Zealand in 2018 and now living in Waikawa, Picton. Her Picton-based consultancy, Regenerative Business Development, supports businesses in their transition to a strong, viable and sustainable future. The objective is to make New Zealand businesses better, stronger, more resilient, and ultimately businesses that make a difference. Thank you for being here, Fiona. Welcome. So as you can see, we've got a fantastic lineup tonight, and the format for the first half of the evening is that I'll be having one-to-one conversations with some of our panellists, so you can get to know them and the kaupapa that they're passionate about, and engage in a conversation around sustainability in Te Tauihu. Just want to mention again, and I will keep hammering it home, that if something sparks for you, you've got a question for one of our panellists, then the place to channel that is to the live stream on Facebook or via our website, so that we can get to your question in the second half. So we're going to focus the first part of the panel on Dr. Bruce Campbell. So thank you, Bruce, for being here. First question I'd like to ask you is, do you believe that New Zealand's brand as a food-producing nation is still relevant?
Yeah, look, what a fantastic question. And absolutely, I think that brand opportunity is even greater than it's been in the past. And I think there's a fantastic opportunity. There's trust in our food, and there's an understanding of the way that our country looks after the environment, which is a really important base for the opportunity. That's something to build off. It's actually still quite fragile, and I think as we move forward, consumers are becoming increasingly discerning about choices that they're making in their food. My pick on what the future's going to be looking forward is that the issues of environment, of social equity, of care for the people producing food and care for the environment that's being used to produce food will become a higher and higher priority for consumers in the future. So if we're looking to actually delight those consumers and provide an offering which actually attracts a premium that the consumers are prepared to pay more for because it's the food that they're consuming is actually meeting their values, then there's lots more that we actually need to do. And I think this session's particularly relevant to think about what we can do to accelerate and extend and further develop that positioning that we've currently got.
That's really interesting. So you've travelled a lot in your work, and we got to hear some of those stories last night, so thank you for that. Yep. And so the perception that people have of New Zealand with regards to food production, how honest do you think that is? So the way people talk and describe and see New Zealand, do you think we live up to that reputation?
I think by and large we do. I think the beliefs that the producers have are very strong. I think there's a lot to do, but there can be unexpected consequences as we intensify our production systems, as we move to different ways of producing food that we need to be very vigilant about and concentrating on. And I think we're reaching a point in time, in my mind, where there's a chance for a complete reposition to actually think about how we make a step change, how we go much further out there to have quite a different offering. And I've been encouraged by the workshops that we've been having over the last few days that it feels to me that the community here in Tauihu is up for that, absolutely. So there's a very good chance for this region to actually define and lead a different way of doing things that really extends that food brand.
Absolutely, and I echo your statement. There's a real appetite out there, pun intended. But in your view and all the work you've done throughout your career, what do you think are the number one, what do you think are the most important ways or things we can do right now to advance sustainable food production in Aotearoa?
Something that helps me to get my head around this whole issue of sustainability is something called the Earth Overshoot Day. And it's actually a day that's defined where the depletion of resources actually exceeds the capacity of the Earth to renew them in any one year. Now, if you go back to the 1970s, that day pretty much fell around 31st of December. So we had a whole year and we were basically using up resources at about the rate that the Earth could renew them. Now, this year, the prediction is in 2019 that date's going to be about July the 29th, so this month. So we're using about 1.7 of the Earth rather than actually using it in a way that can be fully developed. If we look at New Zealand, actually, that date is about May sometime. So we're actually worse here than the world on average. So here's an opportunity for us to really look hard at what we're doing and reshape that use of resources, that way we approach everything, and start to take a lead, I think, in my mind, to actually pull things back to a way of actually getting things back in balance. And that's going to take some hard calls, and there's really going to be no soft landings here. There's some big decisions that will need to be taken to get us there, but it's critical that we actually grasp that nettle and take that step.
So how do we make that transition then? So you talk about this kind of aspirational goal and that seizing the moment and the opportunity we have right now to redefine that area. And you mentioned no soft landings, so for everyone thinking about that transition, and very few people I think disagree with it,
Yes.
How do we go about it? Where do we start?
Well, there's no question that that's going to actually add to the complexity and the cost of producing food. So there's got to be investment back into remediation of the environment. There's got to be care for waterways, doing things differently, actually adjusting the way that the food system works. So there's a number of challenges in that, because I think a lot of people are anxious about the idea that the food supply cost is actually going to go up. That'll be a big challenge to a lot of families that that's happening. So we need to think about a way that we're producing our food where people with the capacity to pay might be able to pay more. And that gives us an opportunity to design a different system and get equity of food supply that's around it. It's not without significant challenges, but I think the challenges actually are the opportunity. That these things have reached a point where something needs to happen, and a strong look at different ways of doing things. And I think an application of science and technology here is a critical part of it. A partnership of science and technology opportunities matched with community and business action to be able to bring about a different system.
So you mentioned that issue, and I think it's something that's come up a lot in our workshops, and when people in our communities hear these conversations about lifting the value of the food we're producing, that is one of the primary concerns. So what does that look like for you? What are some of the ways we can create that equity while bringing in more value and wealth through our food production, whilst not making it inaccessible to whānau?
Right. And to me, the key in this is to actually concentrate very closely on the messages from consumers. So there's a lot of messages starting to come through from consumers, global consumers, about concerns about use of pesticides, damage to waterways, disadvantaging of agricultural workers in the production of food, that tell a story about the things that can be done differently, and particularly present quality information to those consumers about the way we produce food that's different and they can actually engage with and buy into. So the costs of making some of these changes in the short term are there. There's some things we've got to do differently, because they can't just keep running down the system by trying to work to a lower and lower cost model. So that's the hard landing piece of this, to actually make a bit of an adjustment. But if that can be done, and the opportunity to pay for food from different parts of the world is created by us to be able to make those investments into that system, we'll move to a different state, which is very different and able to provide a much more enduring and sustainable food system.
You reference science and technology and the problem solving and helping in that transition. With regards to our decision making and our political system, how do you think we currently stack up in terms of paying attention to that, and I guess how do we bring more intellectual grunt into that system?
I think that's a great question. It's come up at a local level here in the last few days, talking about this is a real opportunity for this region to actually build on the great R&D and education resources that exist here to be able to answer some of these questions. This will require creative thinking. It's going to require disruptive thinking and new ways of doing things. So the science community and the opportunity from that is huge. I think it needs to be very collaborative. So there's a lot of sharing across different science and R&D organisations and education organisations. So a different way of thinking about that is actually going to be important. I actually also think that to address these problems, there will need to be an acceptance that there's going to be quite an investment need to come into science and innovation to be able to make those sort of changes. So I've seen this happen in the face of a crisis, for example, with the kiwifruit industry.
Right.
Going through the PSA crisis in 2010, and really a lot of the kiwifruit growers looking at a total loss of livelihood and a total loss of the community. There was an opportunity to bring that back, and the cohesion in the industry allowed that to happen. Having come through that industry is investing hugely more in R&D now as a way of protecting the industry against future threats. The threat there was PSA, a bacterial disease that came into the country and decimated the existing varieties. There's now a big investment in more diversity in the arsenal, if you like, of tools to develop the future of the kiwifruit industry. So a more diverse set of opportunities and a bigger R&D investment to prepare more for the future.
Interesting, and I know that you were instrumental in that process, and that's where the awards come from around that PSA. So you've got a lot of experience in handling food production and in a crisis. Many people are now acknowledging, and the tide is certainly turning, and Te Tauihu already, Nelson City Council has declared climate change, and that we're in a climate crisis. What do you think are the likely impacts of climate change on food production in Te Tauihu?
Well, yeah, there'll be some significant ones. Reflecting on that climate change story for a moment, I can remember when I was at school, I was taught that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was 320 parts per million. And I can remember reading that in textbooks at the time. I can still remember it quite vividly in the 1970s. If you jump forward 30 years to the year 2000, I was working as a scientist and actually working on climate change at the time, and the CO2 concentration at that point was 355 parts per million, so climbing up. And there was a lot of discussion at the time there about this is going to be a crisis. The science community was quite active in putting out warnings. Now, in 2019, the concentration of CO2 is at 414 parts per million. So we're still moving very much towards the sort of change that's being predicted. And I think what's going to flip things around where people start to actually observe some of these changes happening. So we're seeing the predictions are for a rise in temperature. It's also for more variability, so higher intensity rainfall events, also floods. So water supply is going to become less easily managed, and when it changes, it's actually at more of a catastrophic level. That's a big concern. So there's threats that are associated with that, and risk around diseases, around soil loss, around infrastructure damage that are all likely to impact on the food supply system. There's also opportunities to adapt if we understand properly where the opportunities are to actually put in alternative crops and develop a landscape that actually manages through some of those changes in climate that are coming. So my prediction in that would be that there's going to be a more diverse landscape developed in this region that actually is more optimised for the growing conditions, for the soil conditions, with this overlay of sustainability as a very important part of the story.
So let's pick up on that for a moment, because we're focusing in on Te Tauihu. Te Tauihu is made up of these three districts at the moment, and whilst we have a huge obligation around reducing our contribution to climate change, it is something that I think a lot of people will agree and feel quite helpless in the pursuit of of reducing that, and I think it is very overwhelming for people at the moment. So if you're a food producer in Te Tauihu, or just a citizen of Te Tauihu even, what advice do you have? I mean, are we at a stage now where we should be looking more at adaptation like you were talking about?
Absolutely, and I think you're right that this is going to require the collective action of a community. So the opportunity to collaborate across the region to address some of these issues. I don't think this is a problem where it's possible to say, oh, I don't know what to do, I wish someone else would do something, I hope someone does something. I think this is actually something that requires real collective action, and I'm excited about a suggestion that's come out of the korero so far in this week, which is the opportunity to perhaps build a climate change centre that becomes a real focal point for addressing some of these questions. Now, I actually think there's a real natural advantage to this region to do that, because in the community there's a lot of talented thinking and the right sort of thinking to actually bring that together. It's not a biophysical question that's being dealt with, it's a whole of society question, and I think there's opportunity for some very creative thinking across a whole lot of dimensions in this region to be able to create something that's quite different as a way of making adaptation and actually addressing the problem of climate change led out of this region.
And you use the term there, courageous thinking, and one of the patterns we've noticed in the project so far is of all the themes that we've put out around sustainability, resilience, healthy communities, one of the ones that we socialised in a couple of weeks is around courageous leadership.
Yes.
And with very little push, very little promotion of that event so far, it's been by far the most well subscribed. So focusing positively now, what are some examples that you see already of courageous leadership and innovation?
Right. The one that I referenced before, I think to me does stand out. I really admire the decisions that were taken by the kiwifruit growers and the kiwifruit industry post-PSA, that they actually recognised that science and innovation properly supported and engaged with by the industry was a key part of their future. And that is very interesting at the moment. And, there's a lot of resources actually flowing in there. There's probably about a $40 million a year R&D investment going in by the kiwifruit industry, which is about a $2 billion a year export industry, to actually underpin and support the industry, and an engagement that embeds the science community with the growers and with the wider community as a partnership to actually go forward. I think that's a fantastic model of an approach that an industry can take to embrace and support and partner with R&D. And so I think that model could be very well replicated into a whole lot of intractable problems. This one particularly focused on being able to create a sustainable kiwifruit supply post-PSA. There are a number of other problems like that these focus of community, business and research and development partnering together to address some of these intractable problems would go a long way.
And finally, Bruce, I want to get there before we move on. So you often talk about in your work the importance of building partnerships with Māori. I know it's something you're particularly passionate about. Why is that important to you?
I really see this as a massive opportunity for food production and for Te Aroha New Zealand. What I see happening with the approaches that are being taken by Māori food businesses and Māori communities gives me a lot of confidence that there's some real pockets of true innovation that will be step change in the way that food production's approached. So there's always a risk when you're an existing industry that you get quite embedded and wedded to today's approaches of doing things. And the opportunity of Māori communities coming in to approach some of these things and accelerate and grow food opportunities is they come unencumbered with some of those existing things. Also, it brings a lot of traditional values that are very core, in fact, to some of the things we talked about at the beginning about what consumers are looking for in terms of sustainability, care for the community, focus on health as part of producing food. So you match those two things together, there's a real opportunity for a very innovative step change piece in the food innovation system in New Zealand, a breakthrough piece that's actually there. And the other ingredient that's really core here is the scale of Māori ownership of physical assets that are important to food production and the opportunity for huge growth. So I think the numbers at the moment are being talked about like a $50 billion asset. Activity moving in a few years' time to 100 billion. So there's a huge opportunity to make a real difference in the way that things are being done.
Thank you, Bruce. And again, if any of these, any of the discussions and points Bruce is making are resonating, or you've got more questions, then please do leave them on the live stream now, and we'll make sure we get to them to the second half. I want to move on to you now, Jan. So Jan, you've worked a lot across the country. You live in Te Tauihu, and you work right across the country with the Next Foundation and many projects. Focusing in on this region, what do you think of some of the most critical environmental challenges we face?
Well, I think the Te Tauihu is quite unique in the fact that there is a massive range of biodiversity which is under threat. It's a centre for endemism, the species that only occur here, particularly in the flora and the plants. And I think that the threats that are coming and increasing through, the siege of possums, rats and stoats, which is, increasing with the number of beach masts and super masts that we're now seeing across the beach forests of the top of the south and down the west coast are only going to exacerbate the threats to our biodiversity. So if you consider that with increasing temperatures in the rivers, increasing temperatures and long summer droughts, these species in our unique mix of biodiversity, which is very unique in the world, it's coming under more and more threat. New Zealand on a whole has the unenviable title of suffering from the highest rate of biodiversity loss. Now that's a title actually to the fact we've got a huge range of biodiversity here in New Zealand to be under threat because we've been an isolated archipelago of islands for a number of years, but with that comes a challenge. We have more species to be lost and we are suffering the plagues and the ravages of pests and climate change now.
So it's a fairly overwhelming problem, and there are a number of barriers in our way in terms of dealing with it. How are we doing? I mean, is this a hopeless fight? How are we doing in Te Tauihu around conservation right now?
Again, we're very fortunate here that there are a large number of community-led environmental restoration projects operating at scale. I can't name them all, but I'm familiar with a number of them. It was over 10, maybe 15 years ago now that the Te Korowai strategy was initiated down in Kaikoura, and that was around bringing a whole community together on the threats to the marine biodiversity and fisheries. And there were recreational fishers, there were commercial fishers, there were iwi and community engagement at a very high level to create a plan, to create a strategy where gifts and gains between those sections of the community were all recognised and sort of brought to life so that they were tangible and understood. And now, through the challenge of the earthquake, that strategy and that community actually holds those values of that Te Korowai strategy up high. That's a real testament to the leadership and the community values that came through in that process. And I think that's a real icon to the rest of the region, to the rest of the country, of what you can do when you really sit down and work hard, build relationships and build trust. Because that Te Korowai strategy is actually world leading in my view. And those locals down there all know about it, they all talk about it, and they all own it. That's really, really important. Going across the rest of the region, there are a number of other projects which I take my hat off to. Project Divine over in Tākaka, Golden Bay, totally community-led around removing pest plants that were growing into and around Abel Tasman National Park and the rest of Mohua. Friends of Flora, who have been working really hard to protect kiwi and other bird species up in the Cobb Valley and beyond. Waimea Inlet and Richmond Friends of Richmond Hills, and I could go on and on. The Marlborough Restoration Trust, the Wilding Pines, the work done on D'Urville Island, Ngāti Koata and others have all been intrinsically linked to these kind of individual projects, which has been amazing. I think now, though, what's happened and what was launched last week was a real testament, again, to the leadership and convening of those various entities. They've all come together in what's called the Te Kotahitanga strategy, operating as one, where all iwi and all government entities, DOC, led and convened with regional and district councils, have come together to say, hey, we need to stop operating individually, collectivise our effort for a common purpose so that we can actually achieve the gains that need to be achieved. The great work has been done. There has been a huge amount of human capital expertise built. Now we need to go to the next level because the threats are growing and only going to become worse. But we're very fortunate that with the iwi mātauranga and value systems permeating that strategy and making way with the Western science and the Western constructs of local government and central government, we can actually get a genuine sharing of power, a genuine sharing of effort to purposefully overcome some of these threats. So I'm really optimistic about what that will achieve.
So you reference, you've been involved in a lot of significant impact projects around the environment. You talk about partnerships, you talk about being clear with leadership and strategy. These things take time. And some of the environmental challenges we've got coming at us, we don't have a lot of time. Are we moving fast enough? Can we speed up the process? What's your view on that?
It's a fantastic question because it's not easy. It's really hard. On one sense, you can only go as fast as trust. You talk about, I mentioned the Te Kotahitanga strategy and Te Korowa, 12 or so years ago or more. That takes time to build trust, to sit down and actually genuinely get to build a relationship which has resilience. So when the going gets tough, you can actually make calls with your partners to actually operate with more agility, operate faster and make decisions. However, you also have to be able to operate with and execute a plan to get stuff done. There's only so much talking to do because urgency is upon us now. I don't need to relate to this audience or beyond the existential threats that are facing us around climate change. We've seen the fires around Nelson last summer. We're all experiencing the long summer droughts and we're all having to suffer the implications of water restrictions, and yet it seems so abundant, the fresh, clear water in the mountains behind us, but the urgency is growing. So there is a balance of growing ecological literacy with our children, with our teenagers, with our communities, so that we can understand that we all have a work to do, we all have a responsibility. But at the same time, with the leadership taking some steps now and today to execute some of the plans that need to be done. And one of our projects, the Yarn Zone project around Abel Tasman, was very much strategic investment by philanthropists to remove threats, transform the ecology, and then build a community that would sustain around it so that, and it was almost independent of government, but with DOC interlinked, that we were able to achieve that change over only 5 years. And now with organisations like the Birdsong Trust, the schools around that community, and the operators, the concession operators, who are all, whose businesses depend on that icon of national park, being magnificent, being the jewel. They're all working together now to sustain and pay for the long-term sustainability of that work, and it's crucial that we have these different models operating, which can sort of lead the way, but we can all follow along behind, and in our own context, in our own local communities, build other broad projects which emulate those learnings.
So, that you obviously recognise the time it takes and the trust it takes to get there. There's a goal, predator-free 2050. Is that a realistic one? And what are the barriers to getting there at the moment?
It's pretty cool, isn't it? I mean, that really, to me, in modern times today, defines the beginning of a movement. Predator-free 2050, whether you agree with it or not, is hugely recognised around New Zealand. In Wellington alone, there's over 150 community groups working on that. I don't know the numbers in Te Tauihu, but I reckon it's similar. In fact, there's competitions between the Picton Township and Wellington Township saying, who's going to be first to succeed in this space. We don't yet have the tools to succeed, but in all the projects that are being invested in by government, by philanthropists and by local communities, we are pushing hard at every level. Urban conservation to remove predators, large landscape scale removal of predators on productive agricultural land. We're bringing the farmers along in Taranaki. We're bringing, the large landscape scale national parks in, Yarnzoon, Abel Tasman, Taranaki and other big landscapes across New Zealand. And it has to be done at scale, and you have to build community into it. So I'm hugely optimistic, but we have yet to have the tools to do it. So one of my other roles is with the National Science, Biological Science Challenge, and in there we're trying to shift that system as well, where the science communities are sort of aggregating effort around a common purpose. The common purpose in that particular sense, and this is one of them, is removing predators and targeting just one predator in the next 5 years to be removed, and then putting a lot of effort towards it. In the projects around the country, if we can operate with the scientists, with the practitioners, with the regional councils, with communities, to test and trial these tools at scale, to push the boundaries of technology and then implement them, because a whole lot of science sits on the shelf today, and these guys will attest to that. We actually have to use it in practice with people in communities on the ground. And a lot of these projects now, both here and other parts of the country, a large amount of effort is coming from volunteers using the tools in a practical way. Apps, self-resetting traps, new lures, new approaches, new methodologies, all being refined with communities and science and technology, with values around mātauranga underlaying these systems and approaches to head for success. So I'm very optimistic. And I actually, to be frank, I think we'll be there before 2050. Even though the technology isn't there yet, it is evolving fast and we're becoming more purposeful at applying it.
Awesome to hear. So to wrap up this part of it, you've got a track record and a big interest and passion in developing partnerships with business. What's your message to the businesses of Te Tauihu when it comes to the environmental challenges we're facing?
Well, what's become evident in all of our conversations these last few days, and it's been really great to hear, is that everyone to a T agrees that the all-encompassing factor that we all need to service actually is the environment. The soil, the water, the biodiversity is absolutely fundamental, first and foremost, for the survival of any business. If we really want to be the food basket and the high-value food centre of New Zealand, we have to service that, and we have to reorientate our systems to invest in that individually, as communities, as businesses, and as councils, and as a government. We need to reorientate our systems so that comes first. And when we've put that out there, and it's been well led by Miriana and Wakatu, and it's come back in spades that this is the way forward. Now we need to operate in a way that is different, to implement ways to operate with that in the forefront.
Awesome.
I encourage all businesses to come along.
Awesome. So optimism and hope there. Fiona, are you optimistic about the future?
Whoa, what a question to start with. I think that I'm optimistic that we have the ability to do something about it, to create a positive future. It's not without its challenges, and I think sometimes it's pretty heavy weighing on your shoulder when you're getting into the details, but I think that it's doable in that we have the skills, we have the knowledge, as you said, the technologies, a lot of them are out there. We don't need any new miraculous technologies, actually. We have everything we need. We just need to apply it in the right places.
So what's getting in our way then?
I think that there's certain drivers in the way that our economy operates that I think is the biggest challenge. So we have a certain mindset in our businesses that we haven't always had. I think it's actually a fairly recent thing, or at least since Industrial Revolution, in that we have a real fixation on growth. And so everything is about profit, growth, and there's a lot of self-interest in the way we do things. And until we can start changing that mindset and have an economy that's based on responsibility and care, then those things can start fall into place, because we do the right things first, and then the profits and other things, they come, but they're not the main drivers, and so that you can make better decisions.
Right. So you reference in your work the circular economy, and it's a term that I know that's thrown around a lot now. So what does that actually mean for everyone listening? What's your concept of the circular economy?
I think to appreciate the concept of circular economy, it's good to understand the linear economy, which is what we currently operate in. So basically it means that we bring fuel out of the ground, and then we use that, we burn that to mine materials, or to create materials to mine minerals, and then we use that to create products. And then, of course, we take more resources to package them, and then we use more energy to ship them. And then eventually you have a product in your hand, and then at a certain point, that product is no longer useful. We basically dig a hole and bury it. So it's a very linear concept, because then this whole process has to start from the beginning again. We have to take more energy, we have to mine more minerals and make more materials. And the thing is that we live on a finite planet. There's not an infinite amount of resources available. There's not infinite amount of fuel. There's not infinite amount of those elements that we need in those products. And so what we're doing with this linear economy, when we're putting all these things into landfill, first of all, we're taking precious resources and we're making them no longer usable for anything. So now they're not in a form that we can do anything with anymore. And the second thing is that we've concentrated them in such a way that now they're harmful to the environment. And so they're sitting in that landfill, they're leaching, they're doing whatever, they're damaging that soil. And so the linear economy, it's not the way nature does anything. So in natural systems, everything is circular, so any waste product, it's an input for another process. So whether it's the leaves from the tree or animal waste, whatever it is, it feeds back into the system, and you have this continual cycle. So the concept of the circular economy, it's basically that same concept, but we look at it in two ways. We say we have the biological cycle, which is basically the natural cycle. So from a product perspective, you could say if you have an organic cotton t-shirt or something, yes, you've used energy and you've done things to produce that, but at the end of the life of that, maybe then it's a duster for a little while to extend its life, and then it goes into the compost bin, it rots down, and it's back into that biological cycle. And then we have the technological cycle, so that's your general consumer product, say a washing machine. So you use that for a certain amount of time, and you want to be able to repair that and maybe upgrade it, and so you want to have that connection with the original maker of that product so that you can extend its life as long as possible, and then potentially maybe it can be refurbished at some point. But then the most important thing, when it finally does come to the end of its life, and we want this life to be as long as possible because there's so much energy and resource in that, we want to keep it there. But then at the very end, then we can disassemble that, and we can use those components as inputs. We can melt them down, whatever, into new products. And so we have that loop, and that's what we really want to be doing.
Yeah, so we're a long way from that. And many people would share the sentiment that, you know, we've made a bit of a mess of things with our linear economy. So you work with businesses in helping make this transition. How confident are you that businesses are going to get there?
I think that definitely in New Zealand we're a little bit behind on that front, but there are companies thinking this way. I think in Europe it's definitely already in a number of businesses. It's been factored in from the beginning. Some businesses have been doing this for 10 or 20 years because they've recognised the advantage of getting those resources back, because you use less energy to recycle if you can get the right materials back and you know what they are because you produced them in the beginning and you can use them in new products. In New Zealand, of course, we have a smaller scale, and so it does create challenges in that way, and we do export a lot of our products, and so thinking of the strategy around how we can do that becomes a bit more complex, whereas in Europe it's a lot easier for a number of companies to actually get parts back and products back. But there is some thinking, and there's a company in Wellington, for example, that makes consumer products, and they are looking at kind of the product lease strategy, which it's been more common in business to business type areas like your office printer. So maybe it's still owned by the company that provides the printer, and they service it, and eventually they'll upgrade and they take that back and they refurbish it and they give it to someone else, that type of thing. But the thinking is now, how can we do that with consumer products so that for example, a child's product, a child is growing and so it needs to be upgraded, and at a certain point they grow out of that, can it go back, if you have this kind of lease agreement, go back and be recycled or refurbished into something else. But it requires a complete rethink of your business model. So it's not just a case of making something out of recycled materials or putting a label on to say that it can be recycled, because the chances are that that won't happen. But it's building a whole system that will enable those things to happen. And that's a real challenge, but it can create really interesting and really unique opportunities. And I think that consumers are excited by these ideas. And if they understand how all that works, I think they're keen to get on board. So I think there's huge opportunities there to think different for those brave enough to leap in and just give it a go.
Yeah, fantastic. And so thinking now about Te Tauihu specifically, from your perspective, what do you think are the needle movers right now in terms of the biggest leaps we could make tomorrow if we had the courage to, in terms of becoming a more sustainable region?
I think what's really interesting with a region of this size is to really focus on the collaboration. And I think that's come up in the talks already, because it's really hard for individual businesses to change things within the parameters of their business, or to actually change things in a meaningful way within those boundaries. But when you start to look a bit broader at the whole system, and everybody's dependent on a lot of the same systems, whether it's transport or waste disposal, any of these type of systems, there's a lot of people that have the same problem. So if you can actually bring all of those parties together, then you are potentially able to come up with a solution that can change the underlying system and make a bigger change. So right now, there's a lot of companies that are involved in different sustainability initiatives, and there's a lot of companies in the region that are taking on sustainability staff, and that's really good. And I think the next step is now let's network and collaborate, because actually we all have the same fundamental problems, because that's where we'll find actually real good solutions that make the biggest difference.
It was referenced today in the workshops that we had while discussing the environment that the closest thing we've seen to the current mood was pre the global financial crisis. And then the perception was that at that moment, that whole goodwill went out the window as the crunch of that crisis came on. There's a really noticeable mood in Te Tauihu right now. We're feeling it. We're having it in these conversations right across New Zealand and right across the world. How confident are you that we're having an honest enough conversation about the challenges we face?
I think that at the moment, there seems to be a lot of things that contradict each other. And so sometimes you read something and you think, yes, we're getting it, we're saying the right things. But then at the same time, you see something or you read something that's in complete contradiction. And it's just even something simple like you're reading the newspaper and on the front page there's a big article about climate change and blah blah blah, and you're thinking, wow, it's made the front page, and then underneath it there's a big ad that says fly to Paris and blah blah blah, and you think, hold on a minute, this doesn't make sense. How can we have two of those things on the same page in a paper? And I think that's what we're facing a lot. I think part of the reason is it's really hard to, even when it's on in the back of your mind all the time, it's really hard to not carry on as usual because everything around you is carrying on business as usual. So there hasn't been that full-on crisis that forces the change, but what we want to do is we want to create the change before the crisis, and so it makes it quite challenging because even though you're aware that there's things happening, it's not necessarily affecting your day-to-day activities just yet. So if you want to, you can carry on just the way you were before. So it's a difficult time.
I'm really interested in that. So just to finish up, so you recognise that it's better to create change before the crisis, but in your opinion, where are we at? I mean, do we still have that luxury? Is there a tipping point coming? Where do we stand right now, do you think?
I think that in some aspects we've gone past the point. There will be some losses, especially ecological, environmental losses, so we've gone past a certain threshold. But I think that, that we can still stop a lot of the potential outcomes if within the next 10 years, if we do make that fundamental and quite significant change. So it's a really the next 10 years are going to be really important.
Crucial. Excellent. Well, that's a really good place to leave it. And I'd like to thank you all. That's been a very, very inspiring start to the conversation. I'm feeling very heartened and informed. So what we're going to do now, for those of you on the live stream, we'll keep the live stream going for the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes while we take a break and recharge our glasses here. Please, just a reminder, the way to submit questions is through the live stream or via the website, and we will use your questions in the second half to shape the conversation. So please do grab a drink, enjoy some conversations, and we'll be back in no more than 10 minutes to kick off the second part of the conversation. A big thank you to our panellists, please. Thank you. Yeah, there are, but I can't. Kia ora anō and welcome back everyone. I hope you've all recharged your glasses. I think we had a very, very constructive and productive first part of the conversation, and I noticed all the panellists, bar Fiona, have recharged their glasses, so it's only going to get more interesting, but possibly a sensible choice on Fiona's part. So these questions have come through from the live stream. Libby is helping us feed the questions through for the second part of the conversation as well. So if you do have more to add as this conversation takes place, then please do keep contributing. If you're struggling to find their Facebook page, then the name is Te Tauihu Intergenerational Strategy. Tauihu is one word. And you search it on Facebook and scroll down to the live feed and contribute there. If you get really desperate, then on the back end of the room, Libby is there and you could go and chat to her and give you her question because she's feeding them through to me. And I did have a couple of people come up to me in the break and suggest questions, so thanks for that. So let's dive right in to the second part of this conversation. The first question is from Joni Tomset, and I do want to acknowledge Joni and a number of others who have actually made the trip over from Nelson tonight. So pretty awesome to see people participating at that level. I know a number of people have carpooled over from the other side of the Whangamoa saddle tonight, so that's awesome to see. And Joni asked, some argue that living sustainably is a financial privilege and that people are just trying to survive. How do we encourage all people to invest in making the best decisions for the whenua? Who would like to start?
I think that's your question, isn't it?
I think that there's a perception that sustainability means solar panels on your roof, EVs in your garage. It doesn't necessarily mean those things. Living sustainability doesn't have to cost more, and often it will actually save you money. So it's a perception. If you go down the technology route, then yes, maybe it would cost you a lot, but actually if you look at the bigger picture, the technology route is not necessarily the thing that will make the biggest impact anyway. So I think that it's being creative and really understanding what you're doing and understanding the bigger picture, and everybody can make decisions that make a difference.
But I've heard it referenced, to draw down the point a little bit further, I've heard it referenced that a lot of our whānau are doing it tough, and more than the decisions that you take to be sustainable, just having the headspace and the energy to think sustainably in terms of the environment when you're trying to survive week to week. How do we overcome that?
Well, that is a difficult question, and I don't know that we've actually mastered it at all yet as a society, but I think what we have not done well enough is describe the opportunities or describe the ways in which we can operate more sustainably. There is poverty, and there is definitely challenged families and whānaus trying to just survive, but it doesn't have to be an expensive solution. There are ways and means that are being demonstrated by some families to simply make some careful decisions about how you buy as a consumer, what you buy, and then how you dispose of your rubbish and how you use your transport. Slowly but surely we are evolving systems around transport, around purchasing, around getting rid of plastic bags, etc., which if we demand more and make choices as consumers more carefully, we will actually evoke more change. It's about building a movement from simple and humble means to making a difference. We can all make a difference.
So carrying on, because Joni submitted a few questions here, so changing gears a little bit, how might we encourage farmers in Te Tauihu to adopt more sustainable land practices? Bruce, do you want to start?
Well, if we approach that question first of all by thinking about the climate change question and then extend it out to other approaches to sustainability, I think there's a number of things that can be done differently which could potentially become a win-win for the environment and for the farmer by, as you were saying, changing the approach of the way that things are done. In the last few days, as we've been talking, we've become very aware. Actually, we're data poor to be able to pull all those opportunities together. It's easy to say it, but if it can be backed up by numbers and backed up by hard evidence of the value of making a change, that becomes a very powerful tool for a dialogue about how to do things differently. And I think that is a very good starting point to start to actually provide resources, information about how to make a change and that it won't necessarily disadvantage you. And that becomes what's been termed a no regrets option. But I think that's been lost a bit in the noise and the emotion around a lot of the issues. So bringing it back to actually decisions that people can take could be a very important starting point. And I think that could be extended to a number of other questions that exist around protection of biodiversity, protection of water, protection of soils, and sustainability in a wider sense, which I think we shouldn't forget, is that actually human beings in our environment are part of the ecosystem too. So it's sustainable development of us as a collective, as part of the whole biosphere that actually exists here, and thinking about people as part of this as well.
Can I add to that? So I've been fortunate enough to travel around a wee bit and talk to some farmers in just the last year in Southland, Manawatu and here into Tauihu, where they've already made the change, and over the last 3-4 years have learnt or adopted, regenerative farming practice, biological farming practice, organic farming practice, and there's all kinds of terminologies you can use, but basically when you look at the people, the farmers themselves, they've made a purposeful sort of a mindset change to operate far more cognizant of bringing back soil health, bringing back animal health, and bringing back their own health and well-being. And it's really interesting when you talk to some of them who are standing in their paddock with a mixed sward of chicory and plantain and and wonderful range of 14 or 15 different grasses in their sward, and they themselves are feeling far more healthy and mentally more well off from farming in a more sustainable manner, and they're pushing the boundaries. The system around them is saying, "Hey, what are you doing? You're different," and these guys are having the courage to crack on and keep doing it. Now that's only going to continue to grow because it's becoming financially optimal to do so. So we need to increase the storytelling. We need to make the coaching around these farming systems more accessible. And then we need to, as Bruce says, provide the data and the evidence around it at the same time about how if you're increasing your soil profile, your microbiota in the soil, that's actually going to have a significant impact in the waterways and the biota and the waters around those farms. So it has begun, but we need to urgently demonstrate those exemplars and create coaching and systems and incentives to do it further, not just in dairy farming, but in sheep and beef, horticulture, and the wine growers in this particular region here. It's totally doable.
Fantastic. And along those lines, we've got another question from Amanda Kane, who's joining us on the live stream from Nelson. And her question is, how do we support our environment for future generations whilst honouring and respecting existing business models? We'll start with you, Fiona.
Well,
or should we?
Yeah, I think
Your
that's
call.
more the question. I think that some existing business models, if they are inherently unsustainable, they have to change. Some business models are just not ever going to be sustainable. So, but not all. Some of them may only require a few adjustments. But if you have a business model that is inherently unsustainable, then it does need to change. And it's better to figure out how to change that into something that works rather than continue with that. And at a certain point, you're going to reach a roadblock where you can't go any further with that business model. I mean, throughout history, you see that certain types of business models or certain businesses, they don't exist anymore in this era because they didn't make sense, or the technology didn't stay up to date, whatever, they don't make sense anymore. The same thing will happen with businesses that don't have fundamentally sound business models. So,
You both agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. If we approach the whole question of sustainability by thinking about, well, what are some biological analogues? What happens in nature that actually allows sustainability or allows people? There's quite a strong sense of community in a number of other organisms. And I'm thinking, for example, if you think for a moment about geese flying long distances, they swap and allow a goose up the front to take the lead for a while, and then they drop back. I think part of the solution to this thing isn't to leave everybody as an individual to have to grapple with it and start finger pointing. I think that will be very difficult to actually get the pace of change required. If there's a community approach and there's a sharing of load and support around businesses to make change, that becomes quite a powerful agent for change. So I don't have the answer about how you do that, but I think the principle could be a very useful one to apply, and that might well be something to explore in this strategy about how to do that, to provide support and encouragement for the collective organism that is the business and living communities here to actually engineer change.
So I think we've got a real opportunity in Te Tauihu. We've got a unique mix of high quality producers, and some very familial or close relationships between businesses and the environment. We all choose to live because it's an amazing place, right? If we could prototype some collective small-scale changes where we're using different incentives, different systems and different measurements, data profiling, being transparent about how these businesses, land use businesses are operating, and then shift the outcomes around soil health, animal health, around water quality within small prototype experiments, de-risk it by investing collectively in that, either through philanthropy or impact investment, and with support of our regional councils or national governments with investments, we could actually demonstrate new ways of doing things. System change isn't going to happen by itself. We've got to actually come up with exemplar demonstrations to do it. We've got absolutely an amazing opportunity in Te Tauihu to do that.
Fantastic. So let's carry on that theme then. I was asked in the break if it's possible for us to take it from the high-level conversation we're having to drill down on particular industries and the changes and transitions that might be required for the industries that make up Te Tauihu. So I guess I might ask each of you to think of one of those industries, whether it be horticulture, aquaculture, tourism, whatever it may be, and think about what your message to those industries might be, or some of the changes that might be required. And Bruce, I dare say you might know a little bit about horticulture, and we could start with you.
Yes, yeah. That's a great question. I think as a principle, if my training is as an ecologist, and if I project that out and think, well, what's the principle here that would allow sustainability resilience? There's a big element of diversity in there that's important. It's a real strength of the horticultural sector, for example, if it can be maintained as a very diverse set of crops and different enterprises. It becomes very resilient in the face of a pest incursion, a change in a market condition, something else. So the principle of securing and maintaining diversity is actually very important. Now that does require some sort of landscape engineering somehow, and I don't have the answer on how that actually happens. But if, as a collective, there was some thinking about ensuring that a diverse set of genotypes and crops and approaches to food production was maintained, that would give me some confidence that there's an opportunity to have something that's very resilient in the face of a challenge, and actually for the region actually allowed support that there wasn't actually a crash. And if you look at the counterfactual, you can look, for example, at the kiwifruit PSA thing that I talked about before, quite a strong focus on one genotype, one crop offering, and a very small bacteria comes in and can actually put that under major challenge. More diversity in the offering actually provides some very good resilience and sustainability for that.
And Jan, I know you do, through your conservation work, there's a strong connection and partnership with tourism. You raised it today in terms of the real challenges of what does sustainable tourism mean. when it starts with a cruise ship or an international flight. What's your view on tourism in the region and how they can become more sustainable?
Look, I'm going to step back a bit from the question and just come at this whole sort of question at a systems level, if you like. And I think that if we have, there's two things to this. There's data, and then there's that translation of data around how we're operating into real information that can be used to make decisions. You know, we have yet to crack collectivising our data in a trusted way where we can all gain value from that data as a collective, as well as the individual businesses and individual communities and people themselves. So we need to re-look at how we manage data and how we share data and how we tell stories using that data as businesses, as communities and as governments, because it's really, really poorly done, to be quite frank. As an allegory to that, I would look at values. You know, we have an amazing set of values which fortunately have remained intact through colonisation, through the development of this country's history, in manaakitanga, kotahitanga, kaitiakitanga. Now, we have yet to sort of translate those in a common knowledge form so that we can utilise them in the day-to-day. We will have data for what we know in a linear system, but we will not have data for the things that are going to come in the future because things are changing. These are chaotic systems. And so when there's paucity of data, we need values from which to make decisions from. Our cultural wisdom, our mātauranga provides values that are intact that we can use to help us make decisions when we don't have data. So between those two systems, the Western world view of data, the mātauranga Māori systems of value, of sharing, manaakitanga, and uplifting the whole system, we can actually get through this.
Awesome. Thanks, Jan. Fiona, have you got an industry in mind you'd like to talk about?
Industry in... Well, my background's manufacturing, so that's probably the only one I'm qualified to to talk about. I think in New Zealand as a whole, in terms of manufacturing, there's a lot of things to think about, because I think at the moment we're only at the talking stage, we're not at the action stage. So I think there is a lot of complexity, especially around materials. Most of our materials are imported. In fact, we import huge amounts of recycled plastic so that we can make products out of recycled plastic. And of course, we ship a whole lot of plastic overseas. You know, there's a whole lot of things in the system, the way we do things. And again, this is really about the sharing and the collaboration to enable us to move forward in that industry, because each individual company, it's hard for them to address the system, whereas if we can map out the needs, the uses, the materials of all of our industries across this region, but also wider, then we have opportunities to understand that system in the New Zealand context. Because the biggest issue, particularly in manufacturing and around plastics and things like that, is that we have a unique concept and we have certain capabilities or a lack of certain capabilities in New Zealand. So we need to contextualise things for New Zealand. Whereas a lot of people are thinking that they'll read the reports on sustainable material use from Europe and try and apply that in New Zealand, but it doesn't apply in this context because we don't have the capabilities to recycle or deal with certain materials. So we need to build that whole framework. We need to understand what we're doing here and all of those needs, and before we can change that underlying system, but it requires collaboration.
Yeah. This one's for you, Jan. It's from Sharon. She said, knowledge is power. We are part of the circle of life. Why do we need to be predator-free if this is our natural cycle of life?
Kia ora, Sharon. I mean, I'll go to data there. I think that in New Zealand we have, and I might have mentioned it earlier, you know, over 4,000 species that are unique and that are under threat, you know, from one form or another. And we actually have identified through science that the primary threats are coming from mustelids, rats and possums, which are literally eating around 70,000 native birds a day. All right, so this is not made up. This is stuff that has been learned. If we aren't able to, curtail or control, contain, eradicate those predators who never naturally existed in this environment, because all of our bird species here in New Zealand evolved without any natural predators on the ground. All these guys are imports in the last 100 years, the rats and the possums, etc. We will lose them. And I don't know about you, but I would hate to say to my grandchildren that we did nothing about it. We've got an opportunity here to do something about it, and so we should.
Thanks, Jan. And we've got a question here from Carolyn saying, I'd like to hear suggestions for what businesses and consumers can do tomorrow, so grounding it, while we continue looking long-term and planning for the long-term. Who wants to start on that one?
Well, I'll have a go. I think there's a huge power in the voice of the consumer, because if a consumer tomorrow makes a choice not to purchase something or not to do something, that has an immediate consequence for a business or an enterprise or an approach to doing things. So I actually have a lot of confidence that there's huge power in the consumer. That's not to say that it shouldn't be strongly connected with decisions that producer of a product, something, whether it's a washing machine or some food or something takes. But I think there's a very strong power for consumers to act. And if that plays out correctly, and some of these things that we're talking about are acted on by consumers, that will make a very big difference. What we want to make sure is that we don't completely lose out in this process. So there's a responsiveness to talk and listen to the voice of consumers and actually respond in advance of those choices that might be disadvantageous. But on the flip side, they could actually be very advantageous to New Zealand if we actually get this right, and advantageous to this region. So I've got apparent confidence in the voice of the consumer. And if we've been having a lot of discussion in these sessions about thinking, well, who is that consumer or that decision maker? Well, it's actually probably not us that's actually going to be the most important one. It's actually the kids at school, the kids coming through, the future generation, which is already signalling a whole lot of anxiety about the future. It's signalling a whole lot of concern about the future, which will convert into their consumer decision making if this plays out correctly, which will create a big change. It's important to anticipate and respond to that.
And along that, sorry, Anne, go ahead.
I was just going to sort of add to that, Bruce. I think, the storytelling or the consumer decision making, if you like, is largely perpetuated by the marketing story that they're told. And if you look over recent history, there's a massive amount of investment gone into consumers to fly to Paris, to drink Coke, to do whatever it is. So how do we reorientate the consumer decision making with increasing the sort of environmental literacy to make decisions that are actually better informed? I think that's the thing we've got to really think about, is how we have people better informed to make better decisions for themselves.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I've got a question here, a rather meaty question, I might add, Alistair, Sean. So I'm going to go through it because it's very relevant to what we're talking about here. So it seems that we're way beyond the point where individual choices, consumption, transport, etc. will bend the curve sufficiently. Isn't it a more effective process to focus on choice editing? This essentially means legislating unsustainable options out of existence. The Montreal Protocol on CFCs is probably the best example of this. Engage with a handful of organisations, constrain the scope of their activities for an agreed upon common good. The overwhelming majority of GHG emissions and environmental impacts can be traced to fewer than 100 multinational corporations. These are organisations that need to be compelled by regulation to change the way they do business. Fiona.
Brilliant.
I think legislation definitely has its place, and I think it's interesting returning from Europe. So living in Germany, a lot of things are already heavily regulated. There's no Roundup or glyphosate. You know, these things are banned. You're not allowed to clear foul forests. There's a lot of things that are just illegal over there.
Right.
And it works relatively well. But then you also have companies like France who are very advanced in their legislation. So they've actually brought in legislation supporting circular economy, first country that I'm aware of that had done that work. But they're very good at bringing in the legislation, but not so good at actually enforcing it. So it looks very good on the surface, but it doesn't really happen. There's always ways around it. So it can work in certain environments, but it's not necessarily the only way. I think that we need to approach these things from multiple different angles. So legislation can be one, but often the thing with legislation is you need a solution or an alternative before you can legislate. So generally what happens is industry comes up with something and it's proven, and then government can legislate because now they know that people have an alternative. In the CFC example, there was an alternative, so they could legislate it. But if prior to there being an alternative, you brought in legislation saying we're banning this, then what happens? We have no fridges, or you know, there's multiple work that needs to be done. So you know, I think my focus is really on business because I think we need to create those examples, and then as soon as we have that, then the government has something that they can legislate.
Fantastic.
Can I just add to that? I think there's a slightly different view. And, you know, I'm an engineer by training, and basically engineers love constraints. Constraints provide you with more ability to innovate. And so, you know, if we look at regulation as, particularly when we're facing these difficult threats, and yes, we need solutions which help design us and get a pathway to there. If we don't set some constraints now, when the urgency is high, we won't innovate. We'll just keep doing what we've always done. So there is a balance between, you know, soft constraints and enabling, but also constraints where we actually have to force some hard stops to create the environment in which we can innovate.
And I think there's some good examples or precedent for that. So if we go back 100 years or slightly further, and we look at where fire safety and health and safety started from, when people were going to work and dying in factories from factory accidents and fires. And it was at that point that the industrial engineers came together and said, okay, this isn't acceptable, we have to stop people dying at work. And they created the standards that said that your doors must open outwards, blah, 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 all of those things. And then the legislation came in because there was a solution. But you're right, the constraints were there because people saw the consequences, and then the legislation was able to enforce that because clever people came together and came up with the solutions.
Excellent. So a brief one for you, Jan, I think it's best directed at. So it's a practical question. If a few people want to clean up an environmental resource, e.g. the stream running through Picton, is there an overarching organisation that they can contact to begin the process?
Well, there are a number here, and you're very fortunate that you have the Marlborough District Council, who has plans and staff, you know, on Tauihu who have expertise in how to plant and even how to potentially subsidise some of the funding. There are community groups that are operating in Picton also, and then there are wider entities like the Rata Foundation who are looking to invest in change and actually help these groups make better decisions and enhance the environment in which they live. So that's a start.
Excellent. And a question anyone's welcome to pick up on from Jan, which is, so far the discussion has been about the community making change from the ground up. Can we discuss the place of government and local body legislation? I know we've picked up on this around constraints, but specifically looking at Te Tauihu, do you have any contributions to make around that?
Well, I'll just make an observation. Your point about the fire solution was actually a really interesting story there about solutions coming in advance of legislation. I think if you look at history, history's littered with examples of well-intended actions that had unintended consequences if you take it from a very top-down approach without being well-informed. I mean, CFCs, for example, were developed with the best of intentions to actually protect people from being killed by ammonia as a refrigerant, and it was only later that it was realised that it had the consequence for the world. Right. So I think we may be moving into an area where we have to be quite focused on understanding the consequences of decisions before taking action. So I would be slightly anxious about some top-down, quite brutal approaches to be taken that might have potential unintended consequences that could be worse. I think there's got to be some care in the way to tease out and actually deal with this in a very deliberate and well-informed way.
Thanks, Bruce. Look, we've come to the end of this, and I could keep talking about this all night, and I hope we do, actually. But we have to wrap up this part of the panel. I do want to give you all the opportunity, though. You've made some outstanding contributions tonight in response to these questions, but I do want to give you all the opportunity. If there's one thing in Te Tauihu that you'd like to see change, or one big idea that you'd like to see implemented, what would it be? And we'll start with you, Bruce.
Okay, well, look, and this is probably informed by my experience over the last few days as well, and listening to the korero as we've gone through this. I think there's one word for me, and it's collaboration. I think there's a huge power of working collectively in this region to actually start to address some of these issues. And it would be fantastic to see some initiatives that started to bring people together to operate pan-sectorally across organisations, across communities, across the geographic distribution of the region to start to actually address some of these intractable questions.
Kia ora, Bruce. Yeah.
Well, I learned something today in our previous workshop during the day. A motto which I sort of put out there often is, think globally, act locally. And then it was added on to today in one workshop was do personally. And that means I think that we can all take a responsibility to do something different. And alongside to build on Bruce's korero, we actually do need to, give of ourselves to the greater good and actually be responsible for what we do and act within our means to be different to what we have. And if we all do that, and I think we've got a really good shot at making a difference.
Awesome.
Kia ora.
Fiona.
Yeah, I mean, collaboration, definitely the big one for me. I think that's how we move forward. Without the collaboration, we're not going to be able to make significant change. So I would, same for me.
Awesome. Can we give our panellists a huge round of applause, please? I'll let you go now.
Yeah.
So we are not quite done yet because as part of this process we're encouraging people to come forward with their big ideas for Te Tauihu and we've already collected a number of those ideas through the forums we've had. But tonight a few people have come forward who would like to share those ideas with us. So I'm going to hand over the mic to some people, and the first one is Lynn. Are you with us? So if you'd like to come forward.
The idea that comes into my mind is to create a paradise garden on the top of South Island, where no harmful chemical will be used. Food will be grown in a permaculture system with greater biodiversity instead of monoculture. And best practice will be used to preserve the soil and water for the next generations. In the garden, there will be abundant variety of vegetables, fruit, native plants, and stable food like wheat, potato, tomato, and chicken running on the orchard floor. And shaping the vineyard, the most important part, let's test the efficiency of this garden. Let's say how many input we need to do to create a garden like this, and let's say how many families this garden can support. With minimum waste, with minimum transport, and food harvest at its most delicious ripe stage. And this garden could also be an education center where children and adults can reconnect with the nature and learn the best farming practice, see and touch what healthy and beautiful soil is like, and search for the insect in the garden and observe them and learn the significance about them. And in the end, we could make a movie about this paradise garden and show the world what a beautiful future system could be like.
Thank you. And next up, I want to invite Neil Henry.
Thank you very much. Wow, that's really bright. I'm going to need your help with this, Johnny. By the way, I'm Neil from Blenheim, not Neil from the council, for the purposes of this exercise. To test this, we got a lot of ideas. This idea is only 4 hours old, and I thought perhaps maybe I should test, is it a good idea? So by the end of me talking, you'll know whether this is a good idea or not. That's why I'll need your help, Johnny. So to test this, and this is why I need your help, because I cannot see anybody in this room, I've got a question for you. Out of this room here, how many people have been asked to do jury service? Please put your hand up.
Most people.
Most people?
Yeah.
Keep your hand up if you were happy about that.
Very few, less
Very
than a
few. Okay, that's a good start. For those that haven't, how many people would like to do jury service?
3.
Good, right, this is good news so far. You'll see what I'm talking about now. Okay, so the idea came today in our workshop was how do we keep the momentum going? How do we get people involved? How do we make sure after these talks that we have people involved in these hard questions, the discussions that we've had tonight? So my idea was a citizens panel, and you perhaps can see the link there with the jury service, perhaps. So you may not know, and I had to Wikipedia this after I suggested this because I was only told 4 hours ago I'd have to do this, was to say, well, what are these things? So I had heard of them. Apparently they go right back to ancient Greece, and the idea is people were selected at random to do something. So in ancient Greece it actually was to be a magistrate. So you could be at random selected to be a magistrate, not qualified. In northern Italy in the 14th century, people were used there to be councillors. They were selected as councillors that way. Sorry, Mark, and others in the room. So you know what it is. This is an idea where people are selected at random from across the top of the south. And the good news is you probably get some time off work, like you do with jury service. And you'll come together and you'll talk about some issues that are important to Tauihu that need an answer. So you work together to try and work out, okay, well, what are the questions? We get experts like the great people we've had tonight to come and talk to them. And we've had these in other countries where, so Denmark have used it to make public policy decisions. And I'm from England, as you can probably tell, and if Brexit had some kind of panel of people working out, is this a good or a bad idea? Maybe we wouldn't be where we are now. So hopefully you get the idea of what I'm talking about. You get asked by a random ballot to participate in a discussion across the Tauihu. So my final question is, who would be happy to be asked to do that? Please put your hands up. Is that more, Johnny? I can't see. Is that
Almost
more than we
everyone.
had earlier?
Yeah, everyone pretty much.
And that's my idea, thank you.
Thanks, Neil. And our final big idea pitch for tonight from Rob Simsick, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Neil. Nice hard act to follow, really. Look, it is really bright, isn't it?
It's very bright.
My idea relates to culture. We talked a lot today about culture and the important role that culture will play in the successful delivery of the Tauihu intergenerational strategy. So when I talk about culture, I'm talking about the way we do things around here, and underpinning that is typically a set of standards, or maybe there's a lack of standards. So my idea pertains to a set of standards initiated, developed, and upheld by the community. And those standards, or I guess some examples that we could look at there, is things like transparency, setting some standards around how transparent businesses or other organisations might be, and how, in the triple bottom line, if you like, how they treat people, how they manage the planet, and how they might manage and distribute profit. So transparency builds trust in consumer level, also from a supply and the local support network. Something like you could build a standard around Something like providing product and services into the local market. So what I'm getting at there is you might have an exporting business, so they're exporting 98% of their product. There may be a standard or an expectation that a portion of that product be supplied into the local market. Now, I'm not just talking about the crap and the export. You know, we all know what export grade means. It's always baffled me a little bit. Export grade, everybody in the room, I'm sure, knows what that means. It's the very best, right? But what does that mean about what we leave here? What does that mean about what we're serving up to our visitors as well, for that matter? The final, these could be stretched out as far as you like, but the final point was around collaboration. If you want to run a business or an organisation here in Tauihu, it's expected you play well with others. You know, and it's been talked about here, the importance of that, and that can be all the way through the supply or value chain.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. Well, it's a very inspiring place to leave it, so thank you, everyone, and it's been a real honour to facilitate this evening, and thank you all for your participation. Your participation in this process really does matter, so we thank you all for coming out, particularly those who made the trip over from Nelson. Finally, I'd just like to hand it back to Barney to close. Thank you, everyone.
Kia ora tātou. Ko te mea tuatahi e te kai kōrero ki tēnei pō, tēnā koutou, i tō whakaaro kei wainanui o tātou. O nā moe ā, o nā tātou tūpuna, anō reira kei te mihi. E te kai taki. Johnny, tēnā koe.
Ora.
Tēnā koe, Johnny, e tō aroha mō tō manaki, e te kai kōrero ki tēnei pō. Nō reira kei te mihi. Koutou katoa, maranga mai. Maranga mai ki a mātou. E tō whakaaro, aroha ki te taiao. Love for the environment. Nō reira, aku rauranga tirama, a tēnā koutou, a mi noi tātou. He honore he karori ki te atua, he maungarunga ki te whenua, he whakaaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. He nākahau ki roto, ki tēnā o mātou. Whakatonga e tō wairua tapu. He awhena he tohu ki a mātou, I roto I tēnei ropu, ake. Amene. Pō Māori e, Happy New Year.
Excellent.